Well, welcome everybody. We're excited today that we're at the ALEC workshop, Stop the Cancel Culture Before It Stops You. I'm going to turn it over to our illustrious moderator today, Representative Kim Coleman from Utah. Kim, take it away.
All righty, thank you, Michael. Sarah, will you please run the video? See if you remember this.
You have members of your cabinet that are being booed out of restaurants. Who have protesters taking up at their house. Who's saying no peace, no sleep. No peace, no sleep. And if you see anybody from that cabinet in a restaurant, in a department store, at a gasoline station, you get out and you create a crowd. And you push back on them. And you tell them they're not welcome anymore, anywhere.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Sarah. Raise your hand if you've been canceled, you've been Twitter fact checked, or you've been in Facebook jail more than once. Okay, if you are here at ALEC and that has not happened to you, you're doing something wrong. So we know, we have seen that the cancel culture is aggressively on the rise, and we're seeing it everywhere. We're even seeing science cancel. And so today we're going to talk about a particular aspect of the cancel culture, and there is nothing hidden about this agenda anymore. So Maxine Waters 2 years ago just laid that out for us. It's not stealth. It is out in the open. What the left would like to do to people that do not share their views or for whom they disagree with our views. So let's fast forward to what that looks like today in the last 2 years. And I'm gonna screen share real quick. We see a lot of the cancel happen in social media. And here's just a couple examples I want to show you. Lincoln Project. Here are 2 attorneys attempting to help Trump overturn the will of the Pennsylvania people. Now, make them famous. What do you think that means? From the Trump Integrity Project, we should not allow the following groups of people to profit from their experience: those who elected him, those who staffed his government, and those who funded him. So it's not just a president's cabinet and close people. It is a lot of Americans now that are directly targeted. Now, this was very frightening to me. Robert Reich, former Secretary of Labor, said and tweeted this: when this nightmare is over, we need a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. But doesn't that just sound nice? A Truth and Reconciliation Commission. It would erase Trump's lies, comfort those who have been harmed by his hatefulness, and name every official, politician, executive, and media mogul whose greed and cowardice established this catastrophe. And now, however much credibility you want to get to this one, but frightening. Is anyone from Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, is anyone archiving these Trump sycophants for when they try to downplay or deny their complicity in the future? I foresee decent probability of many deleted tweets, writings, photos in the future. Now, what really concerned me about that is that last sentence, that she foresees conditions under which Americans may feel they need to delete. That should be absolutely frightening to us. So in the last few months, I've experienced some things that I'd never experienced before as I went out and helped Republican candidates, knocked on doors, and when I would find a good, strong supporter, you know, the next thing is you ask, will you please take one of these lovely landscape enhancements and put one in your yard, a yard sign, and instead of just flatly denying for mowing reasons, people articulated to me no way. And they'd look around, make sure that, their neighbors couldn't see. But they started to express that they didn't want a sign. They didn't want their neighbors to know who they supported, because now they feared vandalism. They feared attracting and drawing street protest. And many even expressed that they feared for their jobs. And I'd never seen that. That was very unique to this year. So the left has been very effective at chilling speech, the public shaming game, but it's moved far beyond speech. There is real fear for real reason, and we've seen it. The lists are being made, and the left is clear about what they want to do with the people on their lists. We recently marked the 60-year anniversary of the landmark Supreme Court case dealing with donor privacy and association privacy. It was the NAACP versus Alabama. And the court said that recognized the vital relationship between freedom to associate and the privacy in one's association, because privacy itself is vital in allowing people to support the causes they believe in joining their voice with others to make that voice louder and to affect their beliefs, and without fear of retribution, retaliation, harassment. Harassment is not protected speech, and yet we have a congresswoman calling on people to harass. So this landmark case has been in effect again for over 60 years, 62 years. And, but now we are seeing efforts to undermine that at the very time where it's very clear that we need that more than ever, as we can see that need for privacy is absolutely still something we need. True to form, opponents use phrases and virtues like public's right to know, the Trump Integrity Project, integrity, ethics, transparency, dark money. So let's talk about what's really at stake. We're going to talk about the current legal and legislative landscape and how we can combat this attack on donor privacy. So I'd like to welcome the Honorable Scott Walker to the conversation. The Honorable Scott Walker served as the governor of Wisconsin from 2011 to 2019, having formerly served in the Wisconsin State Assembly and as Milwaukee County Executive. As governor, he reversed a $3.6 billion budget deficit and created 100,000 jobs. He refused to be intimidated, and this is what I remember about the great Scott Walker, refused to be intimidated when his opponents organized a recall election in 2012, and he became the first and only governor to win a recall and win a subsequent term. So today, Governor Walker is the CEO and incoming president of Young America's Foundation, where he leads the effort to increase young Americans' understanding of and inspiration for individual freedom, free enterprise, and traditional American values. Welcome, Governor Walker. You have seen some of this really up close and personal, and really in some of the most extreme ways that we've seen in my generation. What can you share with us about this? What is that real threat?
Well, thanks. And it's great to see everybody out in the ALEC world. As a state lawmaker, I was a longtime member of ALEC. A number of folks from Wisconsin are involved in the leadership over the years, including Leah Vukmir, who is the national chair a few years back. And a number of my good friends are on today, as well as just friends from across the country. So first off, hi, everybody. We're glad to be there with you. To put that in context, it's perfect, Representative Coleman. You set this up nicely, because I printed out 2 bumper stickers I saw in my state capitol right around that time. The first one said this: we've seen all these all over the place. They say coexist. We see them in Madison. We see them in Washington. We see elsewhere. But the irony was, the day I saw that was in the midst of all these protests, which, by the way, the Occupy movement didn't start on Wall Street. It started on my street years ago in Madison, Wisconsin, when they brought in 100,000 protesters to occupy the Capitol, not just because of me, but because of our courageous state lawmakers who stood with us pushing those reforms. But in addition to the coexist bumper sticker, right next to it was one that said, recall Scott Walker. The reason I say that is to kind of share in some thoughts about this cancel culture, free speech, and how the left will pick and choose. They love free speech when it benefits them, but they don't want free speech when it doesn't benefit them. And that's because the real words that they're interested in are these. It's all about power and control. That's really what the whole situation is here. And we saw that. They tried to intimidate us. That's why they brought in over 100,000 people to march around and eventually occupy the state capitol. When they didn't win, when the legislature passed and I signed into law our historic reforms, they moved on to Wall Street, and then they tried to occupy state capitals across the country because that's what they do. They intimidate. They use different tactics in different places. And what we've seen in 2020 has really been a watershed year, I think, not only because of politics, not only because of the presidential and the key legislative and congressional races across the country, but at the same time with the response to the global pandemic, we've seen people use that as an excuse in many places. Many of the governors and state lawmakers and mayors and others on the far fringes of the left, which is increasingly where most Democrats are today, have used this as an excuse to try and crack down. And so you see the combination of people reacting to the president. Representative Coleman, you're right. I've said for months when the polls in Wisconsin showed a major margin for Joe Biden, I said it's going to be just as close as it was 4 years earlier. The pundits, the media, and others thought I was crazy. And I said, well, one, historically in Wisconsin and other battleground states, Republican-leaning, conservative-leaning voters don't typically vote or don't typically respond to a poll. I said it even was more true of that 4 years ago, and I believe it's even more true now after all the abuse on social media, after all the attacks in the traditional media sources. And then the big thing I think is a key part of this is all the riots we saw across the country, particularly in many of our largest Democrat-run cities, where liberals sat on their hands. They were absolutely, it was a summer of silence from Joe Biden up and down the line there. And so I think for a lot of voters, they were reluctant to do that because they didn't want to be targeted, not just because of retaliation verbally, not just because of jobs, but literally because of violence. And that's how far and how radical this has gotten. And any good American, not just those of us who are conservative, if this can happen to those of us on the right, to people that support us, it could just as easily happen to the left. And I think this is something that anyone, when I see things like the post, the tweet there by Robert Reich, those sorts of comments should be concerning because we saw those in the past. We saw them in the old Soviet Union. We see them in Venezuela. We see them in Cuba. If anybody believes Cuba is a great place to live at, remember that Cuba, even today, has a minimum wage of about $17, not an hour, not a day, not a week, but about $17 a month. That's the kind of place you live in, let alone all the oppression. And so it's just a really constant reminder for us that this cancel culture is really about power and control. But in response, it's not just about us as conservatives. It's really about us as Americans standing up for freedom. We live in a republic, not a democracy. The reason we live in a republic is to protect the rights of those in the minority, those rights to be upheld that are endowed by our Creator and defined in our Constitution. And we don't live in a mob rule. And yet when you see Maxine Roberts, when you see this Trump accountability list, that's the kind of reality that we live in. And so a couple quick comments before Matt's going to talk, I think, in some more detail about some legislation. But I want to highlight that, again, the contrast that the left has where they use free speech to their advantage when it benefits them. They don't when it doesn't. What we've seen, and I've seen now my short time now as the incoming leader of Young America's Foundation, YAF. In fact, ironically, I've got an image of flags behind me at up at the Reagan Ranch. Alec over the years joined us there for events as well. And one of the cool things about this job is I get to go and hang out as I did the other day up at the ranch where President and Mrs. Reagan spent all of their time in their 8 years as the president and first lady when they weren't at the White House itself. But the flags up there are from the 9/11 Never Forget Project. And the irony is, this year they couldn't do them in Santa Barbara by the Reagan Ranch Center because of restrictions under COVID. They couldn't put flags up outside. So instead they did them at the ranch, which is great. It's a cool visual. I think the president would have loved having those flags in remembrance of the innocent lives lost 19 plus years ago. But it just shows you how out of control they are, and the absolute hypocrisy of whether it's the governors of New York or California or New Mexico or Michigan, certainly the mayors in places like San Francisco and Denver who say one thing and then do something different. But they love to use these restrictions to clamp down. At YAF, we've seen it for years with free speech issues on college campuses. They clamp down against our speakers like Ben Shapiro, Katie Pavlich at the University of Wisconsin, Art Laffer at the University of California, Berkeley. We've seen it time and time again. And they use these bogus complaints about safety and security issues. We saw it when it came to organizing on campuses, even places like the University of Kentucky, where you wouldn't expect. This is actually a good example, though, where free, not just free speech, but open records, something that all of you as lawmakers are very much accustomed to. In fact, when I was in public office at any level, county, state legislature, governor, I always reminded my staff not to put anything in an email they didn't expect to read on the front page of the paper. A lot of bureaucrats don't get that. And last year, one of the things YAF exposed was administrators at the University of Kentucky taking jabs at YAF and conservatives and acknowledging in print, because remember, it's not just emails. Even if you do, even if you're doing texting or other communications, all of those in most states are open records. We did open records and exposed them. They eventually had to apologize and the chapter went forward. But that's an issue of where free speech can be to our advantage. But it makes sense that you should have to talk and freely make open to the public what we as elected officials or people who work in government as appointed officials have to do. On the flip side, and this is the part I want to touch on briefly, and then I know Matt's going to talk about more in depth. But on the flip side, it should not apply to people in their own private lives. This is where the left tries to say, well, we don't really want to be, the left doesn't like free speech when it's about criticizing them or it's accessing their records as public officials. They don't like free speech when we're on college campuses or increasingly in the public square, where conservatives or people who believe in free enterprise or free speech want to be talking. They believe in diversity on college campuses on everything except ideological beliefs. And then they don't want to hear anything from any of us who are right of center. But when it comes to the public sector, people need to remember that public sector is one thing, the private sector is something completely different. What people want to do, and I don't just mean to give to causes that promote their ideological beliefs. This applies whether it's a church, a synagogue, a temple, whether it's a religious belief, whether it's an ideological or political belief. People giving money to support speaking out on issues they care about should not be subjected to left-wing radicals trying under the guise of free speech and disclosure and transparency to be able to try and really intimidate them. The intimidation I'm talking about is exactly what they did when they circled and occupied our state capitol. No private citizen should have to deal with that. And that's why it's really important that all of the folks listening in and anyone else you work with in terms of fellow members of your state legislature, for that matter, staff or other support networks, need to realize that donor disclosure measures really are a red herring. They'll claim it's about transparency. They'll claim it's about disclosure. The irony is these same people are the same ones fighting when you want to look into spending. They're fighting when you want to look into some of the ridiculous things they're doing, particularly on college campuses. But it shouldn't be the case when it comes to private money. And as you mentioned, Representative Coleman, you go back to that case decades ago, the NAACP versus Alabama, and it's really important to see that the context might change today, but it's the same philosophy. Back then, why were they protecting people who'd given to the NAACP? Because they were rightfully fearful that disclosing who the donors were to that private, not public entity might cause not just intimidation, but in the worst of cases could actually lead to people being injured or even killed. And bottom line, it's basically none of the government's business what private entities are doing. The same should hold true today. And it's why it's an argument that we're consistent on. Whether it was a group that might be aligned with those on the left or those on the right, in the end, it should not matter. Those principles should be solid. It's one of the reasons why I love working with ALEC, is because they're timeless principles. It goes back to our founding principles. Those are the things we should be advocating going forward, not getting caught up in the moment. And that's why this is just so important, why the model legislation, I think, is important, and making sure that people are mindful of this. The last thing I would just say is a personal plea as well. I mentioned a little bit about college campuses, but when it comes to the cancel culture, we see it, even though many of our college campuses across this country have been shut down or highly modified in their instructional agenda or schedule this past year because of the global pandemic. YAF went out and surveyed college and high school age students, found some interesting things, some notes of optimism. If you don't call it the American dream, most students, even in college, believe that if you work hard, you can succeed no matter who you are in America. Even more so, they actually believe the same true. If you come here legally and work hard, you can succeed. I said, don't tell them that, but that means most of them believe in the American dream and hard work. And those of us on the right are the ones who understand that. We understand that true freedom and prosperity don't come from the clumsy hand of the government. They come from empowering people to live their own lives and control their own destinies through the dignity that's born of hard work. But one of the other interesting things in that survey was talking about how many students who, not just as conservatives, but even as self-identified moderates on political issues, felt intimidated by speaking out, not only because they were threatened by their typically left-wing professors, but increasingly by liberal activists on their campus. So much so that not only did they feel intimidated, but they felt threatened even bringing speakers in, because what we've seen, I remember one here in Wisconsin, Beloit College, the students there came in and actually went in and glued chairs up and down the stage so that the speaker that YAF was bringing in couldn't do that. We came back a few months later with another speaker that I helped moderate. We literally picked a hall where they had almost like pews. It wasn't a church, but it felt like it, and that they were locked to the floor. So you couldn't take the chairs up and put them on the stage and block the speaker from coming. Why I say that to folks who are involved in the state legislative bodies across America is every one of our public colleges and universities will claim to be for free speech. They'll claim it repeatedly. They'll talk all the time about how they value free speech, but then they'll do next to nothing about it when the left tries to stop conservative or even just right of center voices from speaking out. So in addition to pushing to make sure that we push forward with allowing people who want to invest in private entities to get their message out, don't have to face the kind of disclosure that many on the left are pushing. The other request I would make for lawmakers is push in your states to find a way to put some teeth into free speech measures. Make sure that every one of your public government-run schools and universities has free speech language, and that they have something that makes it enforceable. I give credit to the state legislature in Wisconsin who worked with me in the past, and our University of Wisconsin regents, because it wasn't just about free speech. It's then about taking it a step further and say, if people violate it, there has to be consequences. To me, it was real simple. You get one warning, and after that, you get expelled. Those are the sorts of things that actually put some teeth into saying you're not just giving lip service to free speech, you're actually doing it. So appreciate the time here today and look forward to Matt's presentation and to your questions for those tuning in.
Thank you, Governor Walker. I would like to invite any of the attendees to please put your questions in the chat box if you would like to ask Governor Walker anything. And let's bring Matt Neese into the conversation. Matt is the Director of External Relations at the Institute for Free Speech. He's been in this role for over 8 years. He is a nationally recognized advocate for reducing regulations on political speech. And in his role, Matt speaks with policymakers from across the country, writes blog posts and op-eds, and weighs in on state and federal legislation. through talking points and testimony at hearings, and I'm sure he would love to help you if you're working on these items in your own state legislature. Matt's also a member of the National Institute for Lobbying and Ethics and a graduate of George Washington University. So welcome, Matt. And as Governor Walker mentioned, that this undermining of the Supreme Court case that has recognized this freedom, this right to privacy, that it's under the guise of all kinds of feel-good language. And so will you share with us what the landscape is legislatively and legally across the country? What does this look like, and what do we need to know?
Absolutely. Well, thank you, Representative Coleman. Thank you to everyone for taking the time to attend today's workshop. I know there's a lot of great things on the ALEC agenda, but I'm glad you made time to be here. I'd also like to extend a special thank you to Governor Walker. He didn't exactly say it, but I'll say it. Under his leadership, the state of Wisconsin emerged from, frankly, a horrifying ordeal in which citizens were literally threatened with fines and jail time and forced to keep quiet, or told they had to keep quiet, for the alleged crime of supporting the governor's reforms. In response, though, that's the bad part, the Wisconsin legislature passed one of the most First Amendment friendly pro-privacy laws in the country to prevent such a situation from ever happening again. If anyone watching today wants additional information on Wisconsin's experience, there's an article, it's a 2015 article by David French in National Review called Wisconsin's Shame. I encourage you to Google that phrase and read it. It's harrowing. And I say all that because this is an omen of what's to come around the country if these kind of laws that Governor Walker and Representative Coleman are talking about. I want to follow the governor's comments by taking a step back, explaining the threat to citizen privacy more generally. Why is disclosure of those who support nonprofits a problem? What's happening around the country, and what can be done? First, I want to take a minute to understand how we got here. Disclosure laws were originally designed to allow the public to monitor the government. A web of federal and state laws requires candidates, political parties, PACs, super PACs, what everyone agrees are political entities, to publicly report their donors over certain thresholds. But today, there's a coordinated nationwide effort to expand these laws to cover non-political speakers. Nonprofits, think tanks, public interest law firms, advocacy groups, trade associations, you name it. These measures are generally aimed at exposing the names, home addresses, occupations, and employers of nonprofit supporters to the government, and then by extension, the public and their opponents. The release of donor information from these organizations could lead to harassment, intimidation, retribution against Americans simply for choosing to support a cause they believe in. It would also deter many Americans from joining or supporting the causes they believe in, and it would stop some groups from speaking altogether. Often, as Representative Coleman just said, these proposals are touted as good government or transparency or even ethics reform. They're not any of this. They're really about enabling the ultimate form of ad hominem attack. Ideas are dismissed out of hand in favor of a name and shame cancel culture of intimidation. We saw this play out in the press in 2019. Texas Congressman Joaquin Castro, he tweeted out the names and employers of donors to the president's reelection campaign. Some of those who were outed were flooded with angry phone calls and harassing messages. One supporter of the president who was outed by the congressman received a threatening, expletive-laden voicemail on their phone that said, in part, "I think you're a scumbag and I despise everything you stand for. I plan on calling you and filling up your voicemail with a bunch of BS. Enjoy that. I will make sure to post this number and extension all over the internet." Now, I intentionally omitted some expletives from the voicemail and I only read the PG portion of it. It is much, much worse than that. But many on the receiving end of Congressman Castro's attack, like the Texan who received that voicemail, may decide that in the future, it's just not worth it to support a candidate or cause they believe in. And that's exactly what proponents of these laws want: silence from those they disagree with. Importantly, Congressman Castro was able to do what he did because information on who donates to candidates is publicly available. But can you imagine what would happen if supporters of national and state-based nonprofits were made public in the same way? That's not the law now, at least in much of the country, but if many in Congress in certain states succeed in passing nonprofit donor disclosure legislation, this scenario will become a reality. I think this is relevant and important as well. Current Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer once proudly admitted the intent behind nonprofit donor disclosure proposals. In 2010, Congress was considering an expansive disclosure law known as the Disclose Act that would have done exactly what it sounds like. It would have forced a lot of nonprofit groups to publicly expose their supporters to the government. He was doing a press conference talking about the bill, and he ominously warned those listening and said, "The deterrent effect of disclosure should not be underestimated." Clearly, proponents of such policies see disclosure's chilling effect on speech as more than a side effect. It's the goal. Although that quote is from 2010, it's also worth mentioning that the Disclose Act is a central provision in H.R. 1, a signature 2019 bill from Democrats in Congress that's certain to be reintroduced early next year. Concerns about retaliation as a result of disclosure have been cited in Supreme Court opinions like NAACP versus Alabama and many others. They've been discussed in legislative debates, mentioned in countless press reports like those in Wisconsin I mentioned earlier, documenting Americans who've lost their jobs, been protested at their homes or businesses, or otherwise been made to feel unsafe simply for exercising their First Amendment rights. The problem is, in the 60 plus years since that landmark Supreme Court decision of NAACP versus Alabama, a number of states have passed laws that directly contradict the court's holding, and some of these laws have withstood legal challenges. Enemies of free speech now see mandatory disclosure as the single most effective weapon in their arsenal. So how is donor disclosure achieved? Privacy opponents pursue an array of strategies. They will introduce bills requiring donor disclosure for groups speaking about policy issues. They'll push broad statutes regulating so-called electioneering communications. They'll mandate top funder, as they call it, disclaimers on the face of ads. They'll try to reclassify nonprofits as incidental committees, as Washington and Montana have done. They will introduce laws regulating so-called grassroots or indirect lobbying. That means just speaking to the public. The list goes on. Though the various nonprofit donor disclosure strategies I just mentioned differ, the end goal is the same: force nonprofits to report the private information of their supporters for publication in a publicly available government database. For those of you even loosely familiar with Speaker Pelosi, Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and House Democrats' H.R. 1 bill from the current Congress, the nonprofit donor disclosure provisions were central. What's important to understand, though, for everyone listening today, is that H.R. 1 is actually the culmination of a multi-year state-driven approach to requiring disclosure of those who support nonprofit groups. In the Files tab on the Pathwell platform, there's a link titled Mapping Efforts to Violate the First Amendment. This opens a map highlighting states in which donor disclosure threats may emerge in 2021. I'm not going to share this right now because I might screw this up, but there might be a link in the chat box if someone can push that or do that for me that will help everyone see the map too. There's two types of states on the map. Some are shaded in red, 12 in total, some in orange, 21 of those. The red states, they're not necessarily red states. Some are Republican controlled, some Democratic controlled legislatures, but the states shaded in red, those are states in which I would bet on donor disclosure legislation, nonprofit donor disclosure legislation, being a serious threat to move next year. In the orange states, a threat of this nature is likely or possible, but not so much a guarantee. But these are the states everyone should watch for next year. And if you're a legislator on this watching right now, or someone that's out of the legislature and you're interested in this issue, I hope you're paying attention in your state. We'll talk about that more in a moment. The final 17 states on the map, those that are unshaded, are less likely to develop a threat. The reasons for this differ. In some states like Michigan, that is a good example, Democrats in the legislature will likely introduce many anti-speech, nonprofit donor disclosure measures, but Republicans have proven time and again over the past several years they won't be considered, those bills won't get a hearing. In other states like Delaware, for instance, the law is already so bad, so far-reaching, that Democrats have shown little interest in tinkering further. The news isn't all bad, though. There's been a growing trend of states passing bipartisan legislation to protect citizens from invasive efforts by government officials and regulators to violate their privacy when giving to the causes of their choice. These bills protect individuals who volunteer or give to the causes they care about from having their personal information disclosed on a government list, and they also prohibit state and local government officials from disclosing or publicizing donor information if they collect it. And there's generally been exceptions for campaign finance, lobbying, or public records laws. Mississippi was the first state to pass a law protecting the privacy of nonprofit supporters in 2019. And in 2020, Louisiana, Oklahoma, Utah, and West Virginia followed Mississippi's lead and passed such legislation. Louisiana and Utah bills passed with near unanimous support, and the Oklahoma and West Virginia bills passed with significant bipartisan support. I should also note, Representative Coleman was instrumental in championing the Utah bill that passed earlier this year. In 2021, we're optimistic that some states, additional states, will pass such legislation. Potential states include Arkansas, Iowa, Nebraska, North Carolina, and Tennessee. And if you're interested in considering measures to protect citizen privacy in your state in the future, please email me. I'll put my email in the chat in a little bit, or contact Michael Bowman at ALEC, and he will be happy to help you with your effort. So to recap, the overarching trend we see across the country is disclosure reaching farther than ever before to expose the identities of Americans who associate with groups that have only minimal or even arguable involvement in the political process. Sadly, the operating assumption should be that a donor disclosure threat is a serious possibility in your state. The good news, though, is that a growing chorus of state lawmakers and citizen groups are pushing back against this threat, and we anticipate more states will do so in 2021, following successes in some states in 2019 and 2020. I do want to mention, ALEC has a very helpful toolkit. It's called the Donor Disclosure Legislative Toolkit on their website that I encourage everyone to read. If you're interested in learning more about this issue, it walks through and answers helpful questions, how to spot these bills, what to ask of their sponsors when they're being introduced or considered at a hearing or on a floor. And as sessions unfold next year, please do keep the Institute for Free Speech in mind if and when threats to citizen privacy emerge in your state, or even if you're unsure what a bill may or may not do in this area. We're more than happy to review bills, provide analyses, have one of our attorneys testify. If there's questions, I'm happy to answer them. And like I said, I will type my email in the chat box in a moment. Thank you.
Thank you, Matt. I'd like to again invite anyone to ask questions, particularly if you are experiencing these issues in your state, if you are working on shoring these rights up, or if you have experienced the attack on these very fundamental rights. Would love to hear from you, share with us what's working, what's not working. So here's a question in the chat box. We've talked a lot about liberals, but why do Republicans end up voting for these donor disclosure bills? I have the same question. Why can't we pass free speech, or the full body of free speech on campus laws in our state? Either one of you, Governor Walker or Matt, if you would respond to that. Why do Republicans vote for these things?
Well, a couple different issues. I think one, there are some Republicans who, we don't educate them, fall in this trap of hearing words like transparency, which is normally, when it comes to government, a good thing. You know, there are other areas where I would advocate for fuller transparency. For example, when I was governor, we worked with the legislature and we put every one of our expenditures is online so that you could go and click all the way down to seeing how much the computer I'm working on cost if I bought it one of our state agencies. I think that kind of transparency is outstanding. And so they apply that without thinking. And remember, this was true when I was a lawmaker. I got to believe it's true for a lot. There are some folks who come in with a very clear ideological, philosophical view of the role of government in society. And then there are others who are good and decent and honorable people, but who maybe served in local government, got recruited to run for state legislative position, who are good people who generally want to do the right thing, but have really not thought about some of these core principles. And so if you don't come in with a clear roadmap, all of us who've worked in government know it's real easy to get sucked in, particularly by some of the bureaucrats and some of the people pushing for these things. So one, it's important to educate so that people don't just hear transparency and think, oh, this is about disclosure, this is a good thing, I want that in government. Making it clear that it should not apply to the private sector. The second thing is, and this is even more challenging, I think, but all the more reason why it's important to talk about these things before people try to introduce bills that would be damning in the legislature. And that is, I think, in some cases, it's personal experience. a lawmaker has some group that says something about them that they don't like, and then somebody comes to them and says, oh, here's a bill. Wouldn't you love to see who's funding that group? And they don't think about the ramifications. That's why I think even just a little history lesson about this court case all the way back to the NAACP, realizing this is not conservative or liberal. This is a lot bigger than that. And again, it could apply to faith-based organizations. It could apply to any number of organizations. It really should be a grave concern. And the other thing I would just say about your other comment about pushing back on university, government-run university systems, again, I think for a lot of people, it's just not a priority. One of the things I hope to do is get more college students to reach out to their lawmakers in their given states to tell them how important it is to stand up for free speech. If we do that early enough, who can be against free speech? I mean, that's something that not only Republican lawmakers should be for, but at least should be some discerning Democrats, or at least honest Democrats, who should be be advocating for free speech, true free speech when it comes to college campuses.
Thank you, Governor Walker. There's a question about what can legislators do to get involved in the free speech battles when maybe that's not a great arena in a blue state. Are there things they can do maybe to help the movement in general, or in another state, or with your organization?
Sure. Well, Matt, if you want to chime in on either of these two questions, feel free to as well. But I would say in a blue state, or a state at least where Democrats or liberals control the legislature, I think it's really important to broaden the discussion, to not just limit it to the groups that the majority wants to talk about, but to remind people, to give examples of how this applies. I just mentioned churches, synagogues, mosques. I mean, this would apply to everybody. And pick out other organizations, the ACLU, I mean, the NAACP. This is not just about, as Matt mentioned, it happened in my state where they targeted me and a whole bunch of people who supported me, not in my campaigns, but on ideas, so much to the point where it wasn't just targeting in the ways we're talking about. They literally went in and, raided people's homes, got a partisan DA involved, and did a series of John Doe investigations that lasted 5.5 years and ended up with next to nothing out of any of it, just as a way to harass and intimidate people. And I mentioned at the time, I remember talking to Hugh Hewitt about this subject nationally and said, if you're a liberal, you should be just as outraged as I was as a conservative, because if they can do it to you, they can do it to somebody else as well. It's just a matter of who's in. That's why I said these are all about control and power. This is not about political beliefs. This is not about ideological beliefs. You were so right to kick this off by pointing out, their first act in the Congress is something that's about power. Years ago, when Republicans took the House, their first act was a tax cut. Should tell you everything you need to know about the difference between the left and the right. People like Pelosi and other than Eric Holder, I should add. That's why the whole effort they tried to do, and he was the biggest loser on election day, was to try and change the state legislative map so they could redistrict themselves into long-term, if not permanent, control. It's why what's happening in Georgia, as an observer, not advocating politically here, because I know this is Alec, so your attorneys will appreciate this, but it's why, as an observation, why what's happening in Georgia is so important to many people, because if both of those seats were to flip, the new majority would very likely end the filibuster rule. They'd open the door to adding seats, which is really what packing is. It's not just putting people on you want, it's adding seats to the U.S. Supreme Court, and then going down the path towards adding Puerto Rico and the District of Columbia states, all of which are about putting them into long-term, if not permanent, control. All these things are about power. And it's why in a blue state, you don't want to make it partisan. You want to point out all the areas where if the tables turn, it's not going to be good for people who have a different viewpoint than many of us on this Zoom session, but make sure they know what's going on. The other part is just give examples, even on the free speech part on campus. Again, giving examples. Why is it fair that one voice is heard but not another? We have a First Amendment in America. And if anything, a college campus is the place where it should be most celebrated instead of being most threatened as it is today.
Matt, do you have any comments? Thank you, Governor.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with pretty much everything Governor Walker said, and he hit the nail on the head. Hope is not lost if you are a legislator in a blue state and these types of bills come up. A lot of those states in the map, while there's a threat, this threat's been going on for years, and they've been defeated because they can be defeated. And what Governor Walker said is exactly right. Don't think that just because those pushing the bills are hoping to silence groups on the right, that no one's going to care. No, groups on the left or with a progressive mindset will care as well. Often the ACLU is a champion of opposing this kind of legislation, promoting citizen privacy. I can speak quickly to New Jersey. They considered really one of the worst bills I've seen last year in terms of how broadly it required donor disclosure. There was a definition in the bill of political information, which was defined to mean factual information. Literally, that phrase was in the definition. And if groups disseminated political information, again, facts, about what's going on in the legislature and government or on a pending bill or a regulation or something the governor is doing, then those groups are going to have to disclose their donors. A lot of groups on the left and the right in New Jersey were up in arms about this, and they were speaking out aggressively to the press, complaining, whether it's environmental groups, the ACLU. There were a lot of organizations speaking out. That bill, unfortunately, did pass and was signed into law, but the ACLU, as well as Americans for Prosperity, two groups on different sides of the political spectrum, both of them challenged the bill in court, and they won. It took a few months, but earlier this year, the judge struck it down as unconstitutional. So again, even though that bill did pass, there are many other states where these bills don't pass because groups get involved because they realize, frankly, their livelihood and their ability to speak out about the policies they believe in are at stake. And of course, people who support these groups care as well and value their privacy. So if you're in a blue state, all hope is not lost. You're probably going to have a tougher battle on your hands, but as you know, the map that was put up earlier shows there's a lot of red states where this comes up too, for all the reasons Governor Walker mentioned. And so, I'd encourage everyone to be optimistic. Again, I'll plug it, the ALEC Donor Disclosure Legislative Toolkit. It's got questions in there for people to ask or legislators to ask. If one of these bills comes up in your state and you're worried about it, you can ask those questions of the sponsor. Try to understand what they're hoping to do, what the goal is here. And I think it's a great resource.
Thank you, Matt. I think ultimately, as has been said, the goal is to make you keep your mouth shut and your wallet closed. So it looks like we have a few minutes. I want to share a story that just happened to me a couple weeks ago. I was invited to attend a fundraiser for a large national group that I do proudly affiliate with. And so it wouldn't be any surprise to anybody that I was at that fundraiser. But as I walked into this building, it was a county facility that belongs to the people. So the people can rent these facilities. So, but when I walked in, there's a big sign that says, in order for you to be on these premises, you have to fill out a COVID-19 contact tracing form. And I looked at that and I thought, I don't know who's going to get this. And I look in this room of, 100 or so people, socially distanced, but now everybody's being asked to sign this form, and I don't know where it goes, but it would be very easy, I would think, for the right people or the wrong people to be able to identify now who the donors are and the supporters of this organization are. I chose not to sign it and thought to myself, come kick me out. But I don't know. In fact, everybody else in that meeting, I watched them sign it and go participate. And I think that was a problem. What do you think, Governor Walker?
I think you should have called it a protest and you would have been just fine. I mean, that's the sad reality with these sorts of things is you go to BLM protest, or for that matter, in some places. I just came from the Reagan Ranch where Newsom's looking to shut down everything again, including outdoor dining, but with exemptions for not the press, but for podcast and video and production and so forth. I mean, it's just this inherent contradiction on so many of these things. But I do think beyond just that particular example, it's a great way, 'cause I was going to add some at the end. This ties right into it. It's why not just this session right now, but all that ALEC is doing is so important. Earlier this morning, I met with Dr. Art Laffer, a good friend of many of us on this session. And Art and I are doing something, we're working in conjunction with Hillsdale to one of the projects we hope to work with ALEC on is providing some fundamental education, just entry-level economic education for incoming lawmakers from around the country, and partnering with ALEC on identifying some of those folks, some of those great young new leaders. But what we found is whether it's lawmakers, educators, professors, or even folks in the media, is just a lot of folks don't have a good understanding. Not necessarily a conservative view, but just don't have a basic understanding. I would add not just in economics, but basic American and world history. What ALEC is doing on this subject matter, but I would say on all the other things you're talking about through this through these couple of days here, and again in the future, is so important. Not just to be engaged as I did when I came as a lawmaker, but then to go tell other people who aren't there and give them that information, because the only way we win these battles is if people are informed. We've got to have ideas, that we have ideas on our side, but then I would also gauge, as you just did with the story, is one of the mistakes I think we make on the right is we think and talk with our head. The other side thinks and talks with their heart. We should keep thinking with our head, but tell stories that help make that emotional connection. And I think that's how you get to some of the lawmakers, including some who are Republican, who respond to things emotionally. And then we can do that and still keep our facts in check. But that's why being engaged, involved in ALEC, but then don't keep it to yourself. My dad was a preacher. He said, you preach to the choir because you want the choir to sing. So my quest would be for everybody to go out and sing when you get back home to your state capitals and with your colleagues.
Perfect. Thank you. Matt, did you have a comment?
Just that your story really speaks to me and explains why everything we're talking about is so important. Governor Walker's right too. A lot of people, like you were saying, went in, they signed the list, and they went into the room. And it doesn't matter what list you're signing, whether it's some sort of something that's like that with contract tracing with COVID, or whether you're trying to put your name on a list and you don't want others to know about it. A lot of people value their privacy, and I bet a lot of people that signed that list that day weren't thinking at all about what that information could be used for. If you get in the wrong hands, could you be targeted for it? It doesn't matter who the group is, frankly. All you need is one person to oppose what you're doing or what you believe in, and if they want to make it an issue, they can and they will, especially in today's day and age where so much is already available online, and there's few avenues left for privacy, and privacy of belief is really important. That's why the courts acknowledged it. That's why a lot of groups realize that instinctively in terms of their supporters. A lot of people, when they think about it, realize that. But it's definitely a serious issue. How you felt about signing your name to that list, again, regardless of context, is something I think a lot of people do realize, and they value protecting that.
Well, thank you so much. We just have another minute. If someone has any questions that they'd like to ask, I'll give you a couple more seconds here. But I'd like to go ahead and thank our staff for helping us out in this meeting. Michael Bowman, and you can find him, any help you need on the free speech side of things, and Sarah. Thank you so much, Governor Walker, for giving us your time today. And Matt, your expertise is so much valued. As an ALEC member, as a legislator, I'm ending my term this year and ending my service in the Utah legislature, but ALEC has been so valuable to me because I do get to come together with people who understand these things, and in that strength that it gives me to go back home and fight some of these fights, but then to have the actual help of experts who can help me in my testimony and my hearings with facts. All of that is so valuable that ALEC does provide for us. So I'm grateful for that as well. One more time, Governor Walker, give us your organization contact. And
yeah, it's YAF, so it's yaf.org. My email is govwalker@yaf.org.
Thank you so much. And Matt, how can we find you?
No problem. I typed it into the chat. Again, I'm Matt Neese, the Director of External Relations at the Institute for Free Speech. You can reach me at my email. It's M and then my last name, NESE @IFS, short for Institute for Free Speech.org.
Well, thank you so much. I'm going to end this with a quote I am stealing from PragerU. Transparency is a government obligation. Privacy is an individual right. That's how you judge your policies, if they are on target or not. Thank you so much again, and thanks for joining us today.
Merry Christmas, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.